Okay, so you're born into this family. And you grew up, well, you were born in East New York and you moved to Ozone Park?
Yes. So I was born in 1953. That's, matter of fact, that's a good question because that's the year my father claimed was the best year of his life because he was 26 years old. And that was the year he got straightened out. He became a made member. And that was also the year he became a father. So he was straightened out in 1953 and I was born in October of 53. And then when I was 5 years old, we moved from East New York, Brooklyn, across the Conduit Boulevard into Ozone Park, Queens.
Okay. So you're growing up in this family. And at what age did you figure out what your dad actually did for a living?
That's a good question. You know, when I was a kid, I knew things were different. You know, like when I went to my friends' houses, I would see how their fathers were and, you know, what was going on. And even some of my cousins, and I knew there was something going on different in my house, but I couldn't, like, put my finger on it. Even, like, when I had to go to school and the teacher would ask me what my father did for a living, my father told me that he worked in a dry cleaners. And at a young age, I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't know what else he did. And I didn't ask him because he was always leaving the house with suits and ties on. And there was always a lot of men in and out of my house. And he would have meat, you know, it was just a lot of stuff that just didn't make sense to me. And so I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't know what was true. And when I was about 12 or 13 and I started like branching out, like going out into the neighborhood, you know, like getting off my block and going like to the local pizzeria and hanging out. When I would go there, like the older guys I would hear them whispering going, "That's Fat Andy's son, that's Fat Andy's son." So that I really learned who he was from the older kids in the neighborhood at first.
Okay, so your dad is starting to take you to some of the clubs he hangs out with. And you start to meet John Gotti.
Right.
And some of the other Mafia figures.
Right. So what happened was, so when I started going out into the neighborhood and he knew I was hanging out in the street, he actually started taking me then to the social clubs in Ozone Park. Because at that time, probably every Mafia family in New York had a social club in Ozone Park. The Genoveses had one, the Columbos had one, the Banana, I mean, every crew had a club in Ozone Park. And he started taking me to these clubs, and that's the first time I was introduced to John Gotti and Angelo Quack Quack and Jeannie Gotti and that whole crew. I already knew Charlie Wagons, who they were with also, because he was the guy that straightened out my father. So him I knew from, you know, my whole life, but I didn't know them yet. And that's how I got introduced to John.
Well, at 16 years old, you get suspended from high school. And I guess that's when your dad actually approached you and asked you, you know, what you want to do with your life.
Right. So what happened was, when I was 16, I got suspended indefinitely from high school. And he was upset. I mean, he didn't want me in the street. I mean, but he didn't know what to do because he never had a father, you know. So he didn't really know how to reprimand me or whatever, or put me on the right path because he believed in that life. So I called up my uncle, who was his older brother, my Uncle Frank, and I said, "Listen, you need to come to my house because my father doesn't want to talk to me. I got suspended from school, and I want to go to work." So my Uncle Frank came over to the house, and we had to sit down in my kitchen, my Uncle Frank and me and my father. And my father asked me what I want to do, and he says, "Do you want to go to work on construction?" And I said, "I don't want to go to work on construction." She goes, "Well, what do you want to do?" I said, "I want to work for you." And my Uncle Frank told my father, "What are you going to do with this kid? He's like us. Put him to work." So my father looked at me and he leaned forward and he tapped his finger on the table. And he says, "Well, if you go to work for me, remember one thing, going to jail is all part of the job." So now I'm 16, you know, but I wanted to, you know, I was impressed with his lifestyle. You know, I was impressed with how I was getting treated in the neighborhood. So I wanted that life, and it was fine with me. And I said, "That's fine." And he put me to work. He put me to work in this guy named Philly the Pimp, his name was. That was his nickname. He had a club in Long Island on Merrick Road, and they put me to work in there. He had a big blackjack game going on, and that was my first illegal job.
Okay, so now you're actually working amongst Mafia members. Okay. And I guess NYPD found out about you pretty quickly and tried to arrest you to get you out of that life.
Well, back then, So now we're talking in 69, 70. So yeah, I started getting arrested and I honestly, a few times I got arrested for cases for assaults. Like I would have fights because I was now, even though I was 16 and 17, I was hanging out in bars because all the bar owners knew I was Andy's son. So I would go to bars. I didn't need identification, and I would go to these bars because I was hanging out then with older fellas, and I would go with my father's friends to these bars, and I would get into bar fights, and I would get arrested they would arrest me for assault just to shake down my father to get money off him. So they would put a warrant out on me, and he would, they would come to my house. He would give them a few thousand, and they would leave. And then the next day, the assault case was dismissed. And the few times I did get arrested, the first words out of their mouth were, "Are you going to call your father? Is he going to come to the precinct?" Because they knew he would disrupt them. So yeah, I started getting arrested, and but I was making a lot of money. I was working for him in the blackjack game. He started taking me to Mulberry Street. I met Arnel Delacroce. He started taking me to the Ravenite, and he started explaining to me who was who and who did what, and that was sort of my education began.
So you start to build up, in this life, and then in 1976, 23 years old, you get convicted.
Yes. I got convicted. So we had a thing. We had this system. We had this thing going on. What we were doing is we had this crew put together, and we were renting empty stores next to drugstores or liquor stores or warehouses, and we would rent the empty store, and then we would go through the walls and we would rob the place. And we tried to do that in Long Island in a liquor warehouse, and I was arrested, and I went on trial in 76. I got convicted, but I didn't go to prison till 78. I was out on an appeal bail for almost 2 years. And then in March of 78, I surrendered myself. That was my first bid.
Okay. And how much time did you get?
I got 2 zip 5s running concurrent. That's a good question, because I always received the most time on all my cases, and I always went to the worst prisons because I was Fat Andy's son, and they had me all mobbed up. So I got 2 zip 5s running concurrent, and I winded up doing 2.5 years that time.
Okay. So you get out in 1980-ish?
Yeah, the end of 80.
Okay. Did prison change you at all? I mean, because it didn't make you leave the life. I mean,
no,
sometimes you go through that.
Honestly, that bid, I was 23. No, it didn't even faze me. It just was part of the game. I mean, and even though I was in prison, I did a good bid. Any prison I went to, that people were waiting for me with packages. I got a lot of visits. I was very comfortable in prison, and no, it didn't even faze me. I just rolled with it because that was part of the job back then. That was my belief system, and I had a as good as you could have it in prison. I had it, and I got out when I was 26 or 27. I got married also right before I went in. I got married at a young age to my first wife, Alice, and my father always visited me all the time, and I had everything I wanted in there, and it didn't even faze me.
Okay, so you get out, and then right around the time that you get out, your dad, Fat Andy, actually moves to Miami.
Yeah, so what happened was there was a lot of stuff going on in New York that, I don't know. He kept on, what happened was there was this DA out in Suffolk County that kept on giving him subpoenas, and he kept on going in to do bids for contempt, 30 days, 60 days, and he told me one day, listen, this guy's going to subpoena me to death. I'm going to change the scenery. I'm going to go down to Florida, because he had a crew down here already. He had this guy Freddie, this guy Larry Bacala. So he had some stuff going on down here already. And he went to Florida, and I started going back and forth with him also.